The blanket was softer than I remembered. That's the first thought that pierced through the fog of 30 years when I held it in my trembling hands again. Softer and smaller somehow, though I knew it hadn't changed. I had changed. Everything had changed except this one precious piece of fabric that still held the faintest trace of baby powder, and something indefinable that could only be described as him. I was standing in my mother's attic, surrounded by boxes I'd avoided opening for 3 decades. Dust motes danced in the afternoon light streaming through the small window, creating an almost sacred atmosphere around the moment I never thought would come. My mother had passed 2 months ago, and here I was, 58 years old, finally facing the things she'd kept for me when I couldn't bear to keep them myself. The blanket was powder blue with tiny white elephants marching across it in an endless parade. I'd chosen it so carefully when I was pregnant, running my fingers over the impossibly soft fleece in the baby store, imagining my son wrapped in its warmth. I'd imagined so many things then. Bedtime stories and first steps, scraped knees and birthday parties. I'd imagined a lifetime that lasted exactly 11 months and 6 days. My legs gave out, and I sank to the dusty attic floor, clutching the blanket to my chest. The tears came without warning, as sudden and powerful as they had been that terrible morning when I found him still and silent in his crib. But these tears were different somehow. They carried not just the sharp blade of grief I'd carried for so long, but something else. Something that felt like recognition, like coming home to a part of myself I'd buried so deep I'd forgotten it existed. His name was Michael. Michael James, after my father and my husband's grandfather. We called him Mickey, and he had the most beautiful laugh, a sound like silver bells that could fill our entire house with joy. For 11 months and 6 days, he was the center of our universe, the sun around which everything else orbited. And then, on a Tuesday morning in October, our world went dark. I remember every detail of that morning with a clarity that has never faded. The way the autumn light filtered through his nursery curtains, casting gentle shadows on the walls painted the palest yellow. The way his mobile turned slowly in the slight breeze from the heating vent, the little wooden animals dancing their eternal circle. The way my heart stopped when I reached into his crib and found him cold. SIDS, they called it. Sudden Infant Death Syndrome. A clinical term for something that defied all explanation, all understanding, all acceptance. One moment you have a baby who giggles when you tickle his feet, who reaches for your face with tiny, perfect fingers, who falls asleep on your chest with complete trust in your ability to keep him safe. The next moment, you have nothing but questions that will never be answered and a pain so profound it threatens to swallow you whole. The months that followed were a blur of well-meaning visitors and casseroles I couldn't eat, of people who said things like, "He's in a better place," and "Everything happens for a reason," and "You're young, you can have another baby." As if Mickey was replaceable. As if the specific weight of his body in my arms, the particular way he smelled after his bath, the exact pitch of his cry when he was hungry, as if any of that could ever be replicated or substituted. My husband David tried to be strong for both of us, but I watched him crumble in private moments when he thought I wasn't looking. I'd find him standing in Mickey's doorway at 3 in the morning, just staring at the empty crib. We'd lie in bed, both of us awake, both of us drowning, neither of us knowing how to reach for the other across the ocean of our grief. The blanket had been with Mickey that last night. I'd tucked it around him as I always did, kissing his forehead and whispering, "Sweet dreams, my little love," before turning on his nightlight and closing the door. When the paramedics came, when they tried everything they could try, when they finally stopped and looked at us with those terrible, sympathetic eyes, the blanket was still there, still wrapped around him, as if it could somehow protect him from what had already happened. I couldn't touch it afterward, couldn't bear to see it, couldn't stand the thought of washing it and losing whatever remained of him in its fibers. My mother had gently taken it from the crib while I sat in the living room, staring at nothing, and I'd never asked what she'd done with it. I'd assumed she'd thrown it away, and I'd been grateful for her mercy in making that choice for me. But she hadn't thrown it away. She'd kept it, along with his favorite stuffed rabbit and the little blue hat he'd worn home from the hospital. She'd kept them in a box marked simply Mickey in her careful handwriting, waiting for a day that might never come when I could bear to see them again. 30 years. 30 years of birthdays he never had, of Christmases without his laughter, of watching other children grow up and wondering what he would have looked like, what he would have become. 30 years of learning to live with a Mickey-shaped hole in my heart, of building a life around the edges of that absence. David and I had tried to have another baby. We'd tried for years, through fertility treatments and disappointments, and the slow, painful realization that Mickey would be our only child. Our marriage didn't survive it. How could it? We were two people drowning in the same ocean, and instead of saving each other, we'd pulled each other down. The divorce was quiet, civilized, heartbroken. We loved each other, but we couldn't save each other, and staying together meant staying trapped in that terrible October morning forever. I'd built a different life after that. I'd gone back to school, become a grief counselor, dedicated myself to helping other parents navigate the impossible landscape of child loss. I'd found purpose in my pain, meaning in my experience, and slowly, carefully, I'd learned to carry Mickey's memory without being crushed by it. I'd learned to speak his name without breaking, to remember his laugh without drowning in sorrow, but I'd never held his blanket again. Until now. The weight of it in my hands was both heavier and lighter than I remembered. Heavier with the accumulated years of absence, lighter because time had somehow made the fabric softer, more delicate. I brought it to my face without thinking, breathing in deeply, and for a moment I was 26 again, standing in a nursery that smelled of baby powder and hope. But it didn't smell like Mickey anymore. Of course it didn't. 30 years had taken that from me too, leaving only the faint scent of my mother's lavender sachets and the mustiness of long storage. I felt a fresh wave of loss wash over me, not just for my son, but for this last tangible connection to who he had been, to the reality of his brief existence. I washed it once, my mother said quietly from behind me. About 5 years after, I couldn't stand the thought of it getting damaged, but I was so careful. I used the gentlest soap, dried it flat on towels in the shade. I thought maybe someday. Her voice trailed off, but I understood. Someday I might want it. Someday I might be ready. She'd been preparing for a someday that had taken 3 decades to arrive. I turned the blanket over in my hands, examining every inch as if I were an archaeologist studying an ancient artifact. The pale blue yarn was still soft, though some of the stitches had loosened with age. There was a small stain near one corner. Formula, probably, or maybe baby food from when Mickey had started eating solids. I traced it with my finger, remembering how he'd grab handfuls of mashed carrots and smear them everywhere, how I'd pretended to be exasperated while secretly delighting in his messy enthusiasm for everything. He loved this blanket, I whispered, more to myself than to my mother. He'd rub the corner against his cheek when he was falling asleep. Sometimes I'd find him in the morning with it wrapped around his head like a little hood. The memories came flooding back with startling clarity. Mickey at 3 months, tiny fists clutching the blanket's edge while he nursed. Mickey at 6 months, using it as a cape while he practiced crawling, dragging it behind him like a royal train. Mickey at 9 months, standing in his crib and throwing the blanket over the side again and again, laughing each time I picked it up and handed it back to him. "Your grandmother made it," my mother said, settling into the chair beside me. "Started it the day we found out you were pregnant." She was so excited about her first great-grandchild. She worked on it every evening, watching her stories on television, counting stitches and dreaming about the baby who would use it. I'd forgotten that. In the chaos of grief, I'd lost track of so many details about Mickey's short life, about the love that had surrounded him before he was even born. My grandmother had died when Mickey was 4 months old, but she'd held him, rocked him wrapped in this very blanket. She'd sung him the same lullabies she'd sung to me, her voice thin but sweet, her eyes bright with the joy of holding another generation. She would have been so proud of the man he became, my mother continued, and something in her voice made me look up. There was a wistfulness there, a sadness that matched my own, but was somehow different. I think about that sometimes, about all the people who loved him who never got to see him grow up. Your father, your grandmother, David's parents, all that love with nowhere to go. But that wasn't quite right, I realized. The love hadn't disappeared. It had transformed, become something different but no less real. I'd carried it with me for 30 years, and so had everyone else who'd known Mickey. It lived in the way my mother still bought an extra Christmas ornament each year and hung it in Mickey's memory. It lived in the scholarship fund David and I had established at the Children's Hospital, helping families facing their own impossible moments. It lived in the hundreds of parents I'd counseled over the years, offering them the hard-won wisdom that only comes from walking through the valley of child loss and somehow finding your way to the other side. I pressed the blanket to my chest, feeling my heart beat against the soft yarn. For so many years, I'd been afraid that touching Mickey's things would break me open again, would send me spiraling back into that dark place where grief was the only reality. But sitting here now, holding this tangible piece of his brief life, I felt something unexpected. Gratitude. Gratitude for the 11 months and 6 days I'd had with him. Gratitude for the way he'd changed me, shaped me, made me a mother even though I'd only gotten to practice that role for such a short time. Gratitude for the depth of love I'd discovered I was capable of, a love so fierce and complete that it had survived his death and continued to grow, to evolve, to find new ways of expressing itself in the world. I want to tell you about him, I said suddenly, surprising myself with the words. About Mickey, about who he was, not just how he died. My mother's eyes filled with tears, but she nodded. I'd like that. And so I began to talk. I told her about the way Mickey would kick his legs frantically whenever he heard music, as if he was trying to dance before he could even sit up. I told her about his fascination with ceiling fans, how he could stare at them for 20 minutes at a time, completely mesmerized by their slow rotation. I told her about the game we'd play where I'd hide behind my hands and then peek out, and how his whole face would light up with surprise and delight every single time, as if he'd never seen anything so wonderful as his mother's face appearing from behind her fingers. I told her about his first tooth, how proud David and I had been of that tiny white speck, how we'd called everyone we knew to share the news as if Mickey had just won a Nobel Prize. I told her about the way he'd learned to clap, how he'd applaud himself for the smallest accomplishments, successfully grabbing a toy, managing to get a Cheerio into his mouth, pulling himself up to standing. His enthusiasm for life had been infectious, absolute, pure. As I talked, I realized I was crying, but they weren't the desperate, drowning tears of early grief. These were different tears, cleaner somehow, born of love rather than loss, of celebration rather than devastation. For the first time in 30 years, I was remembering Mickey not as the baby who died, but as the baby who lived, who laughed and played and was loved in return. The afternoon light was beginning to fade when I finally stood up from the attic floor, my knees protesting after sitting cross-legged for so long. But I didn't want to leave. Not yet. There was something sacred about this space, this moment, this reunion with a part of my heart I'd thought was lost forever. I walked to the small window and looked out at the neighborhood where I'd grown up, where my mother had lived until her final days. The maple tree in the front yard was ablaze with autumn colors, the same tree I'd climbed as a child, the same tree Mickey would have climbed if he'd had the chance. The thought didn't sting the way it used to. Instead, it felt like a gentle acknowledgement of what might have been, without the crushing weight of what should have been. My mother had never spoken much about the boxes she'd packed away for me. After Mickey died, I'd been like a wounded animal, unable to bear the sight of anything that reminded me of him. The nursery had been dismantled within a week, everything boxed up and stored away while I sat in a fog of grief medication and shock. I told my mother to throw it all away, but she'd quietly refused, storing it all in her attic instead. Someday, she'd said gently, you might want these things. Not today, maybe not for years, but someday. I'd been angry with her then. How could she not understand that I never wanted to see any of it again? How could she not realize that keeping these reminders would only prolong my agony? But my mother, in her quiet wisdom, had understood something I couldn't see through the haze of fresh grief. She'd understood that love doesn't die with the beloved, that memories can transform from sources of pain into sources of comfort, given enough time and healing. Holding Mickey's blanket now, I finally understood what she'd been trying to preserve for me. Not just his things, but the tangible proof that he had existed, that our love had been real, that those 11 months and 6 days had mattered in ways that extended far beyond their brevity. I found myself moving toward another box, one marked in my mother's careful handwriting. Mickey's clothes. My hands shook as I opened it, but not with the same desperate fear that had paralyzed me for so many years. This was a different kind of trembling, anticipation mixed with reverence, like approaching something holy. The first thing I pulled out was a tiny yellow onesie with a duck on the front. I remembered buying it during my pregnancy, back when we didn't know if we were having a boy or a girl, and yellow seemed like the safest choice. Mickey had worn it home from the hospital, swimming in its newborn size even though he'd been a healthy 8 pounds, 2 ounces. By the time he died, it was too small for him, relegated to the back of his dresser drawer while he wore 12-month sizes. I held it up to the fading light, marveling at how impossibly small it was. Had Mickey really ever been this tiny? Had any baby ever been this small? It seemed impossible that a human being could start so little and grow so quickly, that in just 11 months he'd gone from fitting in this miniature garment to taking his first tentative steps around our coffee table. Beneath the onesie was a pair of tiny blue jeans, soft and worn from multiple washings. Mickey had loved these jeans, or at least I'd loved him in them. He'd worn them for his first attempts at crawling, the knees eventually wearing thin from his determined efforts to master mobility. There was a small stain on the front, applesauce probably, or maybe sweet potato. I'd been so careful about stains then, treating each one like a crisis, not understanding that they were actually badges of honor, proof of a life being lived fully and messily and joyfully. Now I traced the stain with my finger, remembering the countless meals I'd fed him, the way he'd grab the spoon and try to feed himself, usually resulting in more food on his face and clothes than in his mouth. I'd been so focused on keeping him clean and proper, not realizing that the mess was part of the magic, that the stains were evidence of his growing independence and curiosity about the world. There were more clothes in the box, tiny socks that would have fit on my thumb, a red sweater my aunt had knitted for him, a Halloween costume shaped like a pumpkin that he'd worn exactly once before, deciding he hated it. Each piece told a story, held a memory, carried the weight of a life that had been brief but undeniably real. As I went through each item, I found myself talking to Mickey again, but differently this time. Not with the desperate longing that had characterized my early grief, but with the easy familiarity of a mother sharing memories with her child. "You hated this sweater," I said, holding up a green cardigan with wooden buttons. "Every time I put it on you, you'd try to eat the buttons. I was so worried you'd choke on one, but you were just exploring, weren't you? Everything went in your mouth in those days." The conversation felt natural, comfortable even. For 30 years I'd been afraid to talk to Mickey, afraid that acknowledging his continued presence in my heart would somehow diminish my ability to move forward. But sitting here in my mother's attic, surrounded by the physical remnants of his short life, I realized that moving forward had never meant leaving him behind. It had meant learning to carry him with me in a way that honored both his memory and my own need to keep living. The sun was setting now, casting long shadows across the attic floor, and I knew I should probably head downstairs. My husband David would be wondering where I was. He'd offered to come with me today, but I'd insisted on doing this alone. Now I understood why. This wasn't just about sorting through my mother's belongings or deciding what to keep and what to donate. This was about reclaiming a piece of myself that I'd given up for dead along with my son. I folded the blanket carefully, the way I used to fold it every morning after making Mickey's crib, and held it against my chest one more time. The gesture felt both foreign and familiar, like speaking a language I'd once been fluent in, but hadn't used in decades. My body remembered the motion, the careful attention to each corner, the gentle smoothing of wrinkles. My hands remembered what it felt like to care for something so precious, so fragile. There were other things in the box, a tiny pair of booties my mother had knitted, still soft and white with little blue ribbons, a hospital bracelet so small it could barely fit around my thumb, a few photographs I'd forgotten existed. But it was the blanket that held me captive, the blanket that seemed to bridge the impossible gap between then and now, between the mother I was and the mother I'd been forced to stop being. I thought about the woman I'd become in the years since Mickey's death. I'd thrown myself into my career with a ferocity that surprised everyone, including myself. I'd become a pediatric nurse, drawn to the very thing that had broken me, finding healing in caring for other people's children. It had been David's idea initially. He'd suggested that maybe helping other babies might help me process my own loss. I'd resisted at first, convinced that being around infants would only deepen my pain. But he'd been right, as he so often was. The first time I held a newborn in the NICU, my hands had shaken so badly I'd almost dropped her. She was premature, barely 3 pounds, fighting for every breath. But as I held her, feeling her tiny heart beating against my palm, something inside me had shifted. This wasn't Mickey, would never be Mickey, but she was someone's everything, someone's hope, someone's future, and I could help her. I could use my grief, my understanding of how precious and fragile life could be, to make a difference. Over the years, I'd held hundreds of babies. I'd comforted parents through their worst fears and celebrated with them through their greatest joys. I'd been present for first breaths and, heartbreakingly, for last ones. Each child had taught me something different about love, about loss, about the incredible resilience of the human spirit. But none of them had been Mickey. None of them could fill the space he'd left behind, and I'd finally learned that they weren't supposed to. The blanket in my hands felt warm now, heated by my body and my memories. I wondered what Mickey would think of the woman I'd become. Would he be proud of his mother, the one who'd learned to transform her grief into compassion, her loss into purpose? Would he understand why I'd never had another child? Why the thought of replacing him had felt like betrayal, even though I knew that's not how love works? David and I had talked about adoption once. years ago. We'd even gone to an information session, sitting in a circle with other hopeful parents, listening to social workers explain the process. But when they'd asked us to share our story, to explain why we wanted to adopt, I'd found myself unable to speak. How could I explain that I didn't want another child? I wanted Mickey back? How could I tell them that every time I imagined holding a baby again, all I could think about was how different they would feel, how wrong it would be to expect them to heal a wound that was shaped exactly like my son? We'd left that meeting in silence, and we'd never spoken of adoption again. It wasn't that we didn't love each other enough, or that we couldn't imagine loving another child. It was that we'd learned to love differently, to find meaning in our marriage that didn't depend on expanding our family. We'd become the aunt and uncle who spoiled our friends' children, the couple who remembered every birthday and graduation, who showed up for soccer games and school plays with the enthusiasm of grandparents. But sitting here now, holding Mickey's blanket, I wondered if we'd made the right choice. Not because I regretted the life we'd built. I didn't. But because I was finally able to imagine a world where loving another child wouldn't have diminished my love for Mickey, where opening my heart again wouldn't have meant closing it to my son's memory. The thought didn't bring regret exactly, but it brought a kind of wistful curiosity about the paths not taken, the family we might have had. I was 58 now, far too old for babies, but not too old for grandchildren. Maybe someday David and I would get to experience that kind of love again, that fierce protectiveness and overwhelming tenderness that comes with caring for someone so completely vulnerable. I stayed in that attic until the last traces of daylight faded from the small window, until I could hear David moving around downstairs, probably starting dinner. The blanket had become a talisman in my hands, something I couldn't quite bring myself to put down. When I finally did stand up, my legs were stiff from sitting cross-legged on the floor for so long, and I had to steady myself against one of the roof beams. The house felt different as I made my way downstairs, as if something fundamental had shifted in its foundation. Maybe it was just me who had shifted, but the walls seemed to hold different memories now. The shadows fell in new patterns. David was in the kitchen, stirring something that smelled like the beef stew my mother used to make when I was sick. He looked up when I appeared in the doorway, still clutching the blanket, and his expression immediately softened with understanding. "You found something," he said. It wasn't a question. I nodded, unable to trust my voice just yet. David set down his wooden spoon and crossed the kitchen to me, his arms opening without hesitation. I fell into his embrace, the blanket pressed between us, and for the first time in hours, I let myself cry. Not the careful, controlled tears I'd shed in the attic, but the deep, body-shaking sobs that I'd been holding back for 23 years. David didn't ask questions. He didn't try to fix anything or offer platitudes about time healing all wounds. He just held me, one hand stroking my hair, the other rubbing gentle circles on my back, while I grieved not just for Mickey, but for all the years I'd spent trying to be strong enough to carry this alone. I'd been so afraid that my grief would break him too, that my pain would become his burden, that I'd forgotten how much stronger we could be together. When the tears finally subsided, I pulled back just enough to look at his face. His eyes were wet too, and I realized that he'd been carrying his own version of this loss all these years, his own questions and regrets and what-ifs. We'd been so careful with each other, so determined to protect one another from additional pain, that we'd ended up protecting ourselves right out of the deepest parts of our shared experience. "Tell me about him," David said quietly, and I knew he meant Mickey, knew he was asking me to share the memories I'd kept locked away, the stories I'd been too afraid to tell because speaking them out loud might make the loss feel fresh again. So I did. I told him about the way Mickey used to kick when I played music, how he seemed to prefer classical to rock, how he would settle down completely when I sang lullabies. I told him about the dreams I'd had during pregnancy, the elaborate fantasies I'd constructed about his first steps, his first words, his first day of school. I told him about the mobile I'd hung over his crib, with little airplanes that cast dancing shadows on the wall, and how I'd imagined him growing up to be a pilot, soaring through clouds and seeing the world from above. David listened to every word, his hands gentle on my face, wiping away tears as they fell. And then he began to share his own memories, how he'd talk to my belly every night, telling Mickey about his day, about the treehouse he planned to build, about the fishing trips they'd take, how he'd already started a college fund, how he'd bought a tiny baseball glove that he'd hidden in his sock drawer, how he'd practiced throwing a ball in the backyard when he thought I wasn't watching. We talked until the stew burned, until we had to order pizza and eat it sitting on the kitchen floor, the blanket spread between us like a picnic cloth. We talked about the future we'd planned and the one we'd actually lived, about the ways grief had changed us and the ways it had brought us closer. We talked about Mickey as if he were real, as if he'd been part of our family all along, which in a way, he had been. "I want to do something," I said finally, when the pizza box was empty and the kitchen had grown dark around us. "I want to create something in his memory, something that honors who he was supposed to be." David nodded, understanding immediately. "What did you have in mind?" I wasn't sure yet, but I could feel the idea taking shape, like a photograph developing in a dark room. Something at the hospital, maybe. Something for other families going through what we went through. I see them sometimes, in the NICU, the parents who are losing their babies or who have already lost them. They look so lost, so alone. Maybe we could create a space for them, a place where they can just be with their grief without having to pretend they're okay. The idea felt right as soon as I spoke it, felt like something Mickey would approve of. Not a monument to our loss, but a gift born from it, a way to transform our pain into something that might ease someone else's burden. David's eyes lit up with the same recognition, the same sense of rightness. "A memorial garden," he said slowly, "or a quiet room where families can go to think, to remember, to just breathe." "Yes," I whispered, and for the first time since finding the blanket, I felt something that might have been hope stirring in my chest. Something beautiful. Something that says their babies mattered, that their love matters, that they're not alone. We spent the next several weeks researching, planning, making phone calls to the hospital administration. I was surprised by how receptive they were to our idea, how many of the nurses and doctors had been hoping for something exactly like what we were proposing. Dr. Martinez, who had delivered Mickey, actually cried when we explained our vision. She told us about all the families she'd watched struggle through loss, how she'd often wished there was somewhere she could direct them besides the sterile waiting rooms and busy hallways. The project became our shared obsession, our way of channeling 23 years of accumulated grief into something constructive. David threw himself into the design aspects, sketching out plans for a small garden space adjacent to the NICU, complete with comfortable seating, soft lighting, and a small water feature that would provide gentle background sound. I focused on the practical elements, working with grief counselors to understand what families needed most, researching other hospitals that had similar spaces, figuring out funding and maintenance. But it was more than just a project. It was a way of talking about Mickey without the conversation feeling heavy or forbidden. When we discussed the memorial plaques that would line the garden path, we could imagine Mickey's name among them. When we chose the types of flowers to plant, we could consider what he might have liked. The garden became a bridge between the son we'd lost and the life we were still living, a way to include him in our present without being trapped in our past. I found myself thinking about him differently as the weeks passed. Instead of the sharp, immediate pain that had always accompanied thoughts of Mickey, I began to feel something softer, more like the gentle sadness you might feel when remembering a beautiful sunset that had ended too soon. The grief was still there, would always be there, but it no longer felt like it was consuming me from the inside out. David noticed the change too. One evening, as we sat at the kitchen table surrounded by garden catalogs and hospital blueprints, he reached across and took my hand. "You seem lighter," he said. "Not happy exactly, but less burdened." He was right. I did feel lighter, as if I'd been carrying a heavy pack for so long that I'd forgotten what it felt like to walk without that weight on my shoulders. The blanket had become a regular presence in our living room, folded neatly on the back of the couch where I could see it, but didn't feel compelled to hold it constantly. Sometimes I would catch David touching it as he passed by, his fingers gentle on the soft fabric, and I knew he was thinking about Mickey too. The hospital approved our proposal in early spring, just as the first crocuses were pushing through the snow in our own backyard. They offered us a small plot of land that had been sitting unused, a corner space that got good morning light and was visible from several of the NICU windows. When we walked the space for the first time with the facilities manager, I could picture it so clearly. The curved pathways, the memorial stones, the bench where exhausted parents could sit and just breathe. "We'll need to start with the hardscaping," David explained to me that night, his architect's mind already working through the logistics. The pathways and the water feature, then the plantings. If we start now, we could have it ready by fall. Fall. Mickey's birthday month. The timing felt intentional, meaningful in a way that made my chest tight with emotion. "That would be perfect," I said, and meant it. We broke ground on a Tuesday morning in May. just the two of us and a small crew that David had hired. I'd taken the day off work, something I rarely did for anything that wasn't an emergency, but this felt important enough to warrant the exception. The first shovelful of earth felt ceremonial, like we were planting Mickey himself in this space, giving him a place to exist in the world even though he'd never gotten to walk through it. The work was harder than I'd expected, more physical and more emotional. There were days when I had to step away from the garden and sit in my car, overwhelmed by the weight of what we were creating. But there were also days when the work felt healing, when I could lose myself in the simple act of placing stones or measuring distances, when my hands in the dirt felt like a form of prayer. David was patient with my fluctuating emotions, understanding when I needed space and when I needed his presence. He'd learned to read my moods over the years, but this project seemed to deepen his intuition about what I needed. Sometimes he would appear beside me with a cup of coffee just when my energy was flagging. Other times he would quietly take over whatever task I was struggling with, not because he thought I couldn't handle it, but because he could see that I needed a moment to collect myself. The garden began to take shape slowly, organically. The curved pathways emerged first, then the small circular area where the water feature would go. We'd chosen a simple design, a low stone basin with water that would bubble up gently from the center, creating soft ripples but no dramatic splashing. The sound needed to be soothing, not distracting, something that would provide white noise for private conversations or quiet reflection. As summer progressed, we began adding the plantings. I'd researched extensively, choosing flowers and shrubs that would bloom at different times throughout the year, ensuring that the garden would never look completely barren. There were early spring bulbs, summer perennials, fall-blooming asters, and evergreen shrubs that would provide structure and color even in winter. Each plant felt like a small act of faith, a belief that this space would continue to serve families long after David and I were gone. The memorial stones were the last element to be installed, and also the most emotionally challenging. We'd worked with a local stonecutter to create small granite markers that families could purchase to honor their babies. Each stone would be engraved with a name and dates, if the family chose, or sometimes just a simple message of love. The first stone we placed was Mickey's, positioned near the center of the garden where the morning light would hit it directly. The dedication ceremony took place on a crisp October morning, exactly 1 year after I'd found Mickey's blanket in my mother's attic. The timing felt intentional, though we hadn't planned it that way. The leaves on the maple tree we'd planted were just beginning to turn, creating a canopy of gold and amber over the small gathering of families who had come to witness the opening of what we'd decided to call the Garden of Remembrance. I stood at the edge of the garden, Mickey's blanket folded carefully in my arms, not the same way I'd carried it 30 years ago, but with a different kind of reverence now. David's hand was warm on my shoulder, and I could feel the presence of the other families around us, each carrying their own stories of love and loss. Some were recent losses, parents whose grief was still raw and overwhelming. Others, like us, had been carrying their children's memories for years, decades even. Dr. Martinez spoke first, her voice carrying across the small space as she talked about the importance of acknowledging grief, of creating spaces where sorrow could exist alongside healing. She mentioned Mickey by name and several other babies who had been lost over the years, and I felt something shift in my chest. Not the sharp pain I'd expected, but a kind of expansion, as if my heart was making room for something new. When it was my turn to speak, I found myself looking out at the faces gathered around me. Mothers and fathers, grandparents, siblings who had lost brothers and sisters they'd never really gotten to know. I thought about the woman I'd been 30 years ago, how desperately I'd needed something like this, some acknowledgement that Mickey's brief life had mattered, that my love for him was real and valid and worthy of recognition. 30 years ago, I began, my voice steadier than I'd expected. I lost my son Mickey when he was just 8 months old. For most of those 30 years, I thought healing meant forgetting, that moving forward meant leaving him behind. I was wrong about that. Healing doesn't mean forgetting. It means learning to carry our love in a way that honors both our children and ourselves. I unfolded Mickey's blanket then, holding it up so everyone could see the faded yellow fabric, the careful stitching my mother had done around the edges. This blanket kept my son warm during his short life. Today, I'm placing it here not as an ending, but as a beginning. A reminder that love doesn't die when our children do, and that sometimes the most powerful thing we can do with our grief is transform it into something that helps others. I walked to Mickey's memorial stone and draped the blanket over it, the soft fabric settling against the granite like a gentle embrace. The symbolism wasn't lost on me. I was finally able to tuck my son in one last time, but in a way that felt like a gift rather than a goodbye. The other families began to move through the garden then, some placing flowers on the memorial stones, others simply sitting on the benches we'd installed, allowing themselves to feel whatever they needed to feel in this space we'd created. I watched a young mother, probably not much older than I'd been when I lost Mickey, trace her finger along one of the newer stones. Her husband stood behind her, his hand on her back, and I could see in their posture the same devastation I'd carried for so long. I approached them slowly, not wanting to intrude, but feeling drawn to offer something, some small comfort. "I'm Sarah," I said quietly. "My son Mickey is memorialized here too." The woman looked up at me with eyes that were red-rimmed but dry, as if she'd cried so much she had no tears left. "Emma," she said, "our daughter Lily, she was born sleeping 3 months ago." The phrase hit me like a physical blow. Born sleeping. Such a gentle way to describe something so devastating. "I'm so sorry," I said, and meant it with every fiber of my being. "How are you doing?" Emma's laugh was bitter, hollow. "Everyone keeps asking me that. How do you think I'm doing? My baby is dead." I nodded, remembering that anger, that fury at the world's insistence on normal social interactions when nothing would ever be normal again. "You're right," I said. "That was a stupid question. Of course you're not doing well. Of course everything is terrible." Something in her face shifted, a small crack in the wall she'd built around her grief. "Everyone wants me to be okay," she whispered. "They want me to move on, to try again, to focus on the future. But I don't want to move on. I want my daughter." "Of course you do," I said, sitting down on the bench beside her. "And you always will. That's not something you have to get over or move past. That's love, and love doesn't have an expiration date." We sat in silence for a while, watching the other families move through the garden. David was talking quietly with Emma's husband, and I could see the recognition passing between them, the understanding that only comes from having walked this particular path. The afternoon sun was warm on our faces, and I found myself thinking about all the conversations like this one that would happen in this space, all the moments of connection and understanding that would grow from the seeds of our shared sorrow. "Does it get easier?" Emma asked eventually, her voice so quiet I almost didn't hear her. I considered the question carefully, thinking about the woman I'd been 30 years ago and the woman I was now. "It gets different," I said finally. "The pain doesn't go away, but it changes shape. It becomes something you can carry instead of something that carries you. And you learn that healing doesn't mean forgetting. It means finding ways to honor your love that don't destroy you in the process." Emma nodded slowly, and I could see her processing this, trying to imagine a future where her grief might be bearable. "I don't know how to do that," she admitted. "You don't have to know yet," I told her. "Right now, you just have to survive. One day, 1 hour, 1 breath at a time. The rest will come when you're ready for it." As the ceremony wound down and families began to leave, I found myself reluctant to go. This garden, this space we'd created, felt like a living testament to Mickey's life and to all the babies who would be remembered here. But more than that, it felt like proof that love could be transformed, that grief could become something generative rather than just destructive. David found me sitting on the bench where I'd talked with Emma, staring at Mickey's memorial stone with his blanket still draped over it. "Ready to go home?" he asked gently. I looked around the garden one more time, taking in the carefully planted flowers, the memorial stones catching the late afternoon light, the sense of peace that seemed to emanate from this small corner of the world we'd helped create. "Actually," I said, "I think I already am home."